So we started watching this video. We got a good chunk of the way through, and it was fascinating. I was like, wow, this is interesting, but they had nothing to say. And I turned it off because I was like, I was doing my reaction while I was playing a game, but like there was nothing to say outside of like the introduction where they were talking about like language in a very interesting way. It was really interesting. I would recommend watching the full thing. But then I remembered that it was called How Anti-Racism is Hurting Black America, and I forgot that this wasn't about like the theory of language. So I had a bruh moment. Because I just realized, I'm like, wait a minute. This video wasn't about, like, I probably wouldn't have watched it if it said, oh, I'm going to talk to some guy about language. Like, I don't care about that. It was really interesting. They forced me to do it. I got lost in it and I started to turn it off because I wasn't reacting hard enough. But anyway, it actually is a video. We'll start here. It starts in about half an hour in is when they start talking about race in some capacity. So we're going to try to like talk about that. Now, here's the thing. I've been talking about, we've been talking about, it's called How Anti-Racism is Hurting Black America. I've been talking a lot lately about the racism of like progressives, the progressive racism. Like we know like more like conservative leaning racism tends to be not caring about the issues of people of color, as well as, just throwing out pro-gamer words. However, progressive racism is a different animal nobody talks about. It is the tokenizing of issues of people of color for attention. That's all it is, without actually caring about it, right? So what did we do? We did black squares. Hey guys, Instagram black squares, Black Lives Matter, am I right? Hey, what did that do? Nothing. Nobody gave a shit. Okay, it didn't do anything. It's hard to identify sometimes because a lot of people will say the right things or they'll say what they think are the right things. But for a lot of times it's just them trying to appear woke and virtuous, and it's usually no offense, but it's usually white people telling other white people that like they like black people. It's really what it is, as well as like a desperation for like black validation in the form of like, oh, you can come to the cookout. Like those words mean a lot to white people. And they mean especially a lot to me because I'm hungry. So let's watch this video up until to that point. Like let's talk about him because apparently he wrote a book on woke racism. Let's do this.
To read an awful lot of great books, and I don't regret it. I really enjoyed it, but it was really just a passing phase when I was in my early 20s.
Yeah, I did wonder about that relationship and thought that there might be some connection. What is it about the mid 30s that fascinates you so much?
The mid 30s looked good, and it was a terrible.
But the mid 30s, like 1930s, or are we talking about? I'm in my early 30s, and I do not look good at all.
Terrible, classist, racist, sexist time. Everybody's smoking cigarettes. It's not that I think that it was somehow better, but
it sounds pretty base to me.
If you think about it, the 1930s, the fashions, the people looked good, their hair looked good, the cars looked good, the music hit a really sweet spot in terms of how a swing band sounded, or even before that, an early jazz band sounded.
It sounded like this guy's basically telling me that racism is good because the music was better in cigarettes. So, like, listen, maybe we should go back to the racism thing. Might not be a bad idea. It is a bad idea. But
and then there was an awful lot of great leftist literature. The 30s jazz.
It's just 30s jazz is great, man.
A great era. The 40s, I kind of lose it, but the 30s was just great feeling. I just love to walk around in it for 7 days.
Based, yeah.
So, all right, let me ask you some more questions. So as you developed your career as an early professor, you stopped being an assistant professor, and you were at, it's just escaped my mind. Where were you first
Cornell.
as a professor? Cornell. And then you went to the Manhattan Institute, a conservative think tank.
I did, yeah.
Okay, so obviously that requires some...
Yeah, so I just wanted to bring it up because I watched it already. But at the beginning of this video, he mentions about how like when he grew up, he was like very liberal and leftist, and now by today's standards, like people on the left would just like lambast him for what he would say. It was just something interesting to bring up. I didn't rewatch that part for this video.
Explanation, and so one of the things I kind of wonder about maybe you could shed some light on is what attracted you to conservatism to the degree that you were attracted, and what is conservatism now? I've been trying to puzzle this out psychologically. I'm not thinking about it so much politically because, I think there's room for liberal thought and for conservative thought, and that the dialogue between those two is absolutely necessary.
100%. I think that people like to look at conservatives as the bad guys. I know in America, politics is horrible. Not that it's great in any other place, but, But there's a need for progressive-minded people, and there's a need for conservative-minded people. And I know people don't like to think of it that way, but directionless progress is not a positive thing. And we're seeing that today, where people are having like absolute meltdowns, calling people racist and over everything, and sexist and transphobic over everything. It doesn't matter. The Will Smith argument is the perfect example, where people were saying that was a race issue, and it wasn't. And you can be as upset as you want, but it wasn't a race issue. But that's progressive ideology going too far. There's people now that like they think you're transphobic because you simply don't think that trans women should compete in sports with cis women because it's an unfair advantage. And there are people who are transphobic who say that, but I think that there's a good amount of people who just like they want trans people to be valid, but they realize that this isn't fair. And that would be just complete like progress for the sake of progress without any actual rational thought behind it. And so the counter argument of like the counterbalance of conservatism, like, yeah, is it bad? It's like, yeah, extreme conservatism is horrible, of course. Like we're talking about like bringing back neo-Nazis, but most conservatives are just like, hey, listen, like I want to either stay where we are now, or because it benefits them in some capacity. They may not actively understand that, which is ignorant, or they might just feel like we're moving too fast and like we have to take our steps carefully, because a lot of times when you move forward, you can't necessarily go back, and it's just a good counterbalance. It's actually necessary. Like progressives want to make progress, conservatives want to stall progress, but like at the end of the day, just moving for the sake of moving, if you're not moving with a purpose, then what's the point? We could shatter society by going too far left. I'm just being honest with you, or rather too far left too quickly in the incorrect manner. Okay. And we're seeing some of that now. So,
but what was it about conservatism that attracted you? Because it's not an obvious choice.
No, it was really a matter of an eccentricity about the way race has been discussed in this country in the mainstream for a very long time. I was raised by a mother who was a teacher of social work in the 1970s.
Okay, well now they're going to bring this part up that
Who actually
they must have done an intro that cut this into the beginning.
Actually taught a course called Racism 101. My mother taught me what is today the woke line on how race works, and the things that she taught me were correct. And I have to this day never voted Republican. I am a Democrat. I am a liberal. I always say I am a black liberal of about 1960. But I found as I came of age that as I analyzed the sociopolitical things happening around me that concerned race, that I didn't agree with what was supposed to be the default kinds of assumptions. And I found that my assumptions, which I think would have, endeared me thoroughly to the NAACP in 1960, were considered repulsive, inappropriate, naive, or conservative. And so the Manhattan Institute, I didn't choose it. A lot of people think that I'm much more self-directed than I am. A think tank taps you. I barely knew what a think tank was, but they were doing work on race in New York City and beyond that I agreed with. And what they were saying was not black people are all thugs and criminals and they need to shape up. They were working with, for example, Cory Booker, who was the mayor of Newark then, on prisoner reentry programs. They were really trying to do good work for black people. And I didn't see any other think tank that was doing anything like that. And they summoned me. The Manhattan Institute is a conservative think tank, but they've always been hospitable to an extent to Democrats. I was not the only one there. But understandably, while I was there, and I was there for a good long time, a lot of people thought that meant that I was a conservative Republican, whereas it's not that. My views, if anybody were to bother to read the work that I've been doing for what I hate to say is 20 years now, they'd see I don't disagree with any of the things that
I feel that, man. I'm just so old.
You would consider to be the liberal orthodoxy, except when it comes to a certain plangent view of race relations where the idea is that the proper black thing to do is to cry weakness rather than look for solutions. I don't get that. And I know that my civil rights forebears wouldn't have gotten that either, but that's considered a conservative take only because what's considered the mainstream take on race has moved so far to the radical left.
I wonder what he means by that. I wonder exactly what he means by that, because when I think about conservatives on race, a lot of times they come with like the pick yourself up by your bootstraps argument. And of course, it's just not possible for everybody to just simply pick themselves up by their bootstraps. When you've been put into a scenario where you're effectively designed to fail, you're in a poor area. That's like rampant with crime and poverty. And honestly, even the introduction of our welfare system, I think, ravaged black communities. I think we need to reform our welfare system. It clearly doesn't provide opportunity in poor areas. Maybe in like more, healthier economic areas, it might be a nice little like stopgap to get you back into the workplace. But when you live in a very poor area, it simply doesn't help. Like it stagnates you. And so, it's not exactly the most, it's better than nothing, of course, but we need to reform it and allow people opportunity because as we know, the conditionality of welfare telling people you have to be poor to get money, of course, is going to make people stay poor. Because, if your option is that or a minimum wage job, you're probably going to take the welfare. I would, because why do more work for the same amount when you could just not do that? And that's why I've actually been more for like a negative income tax lately instead of a universal basic income. But yeah.
So let's unpack that a bit. So what I'd like, I kind of look at all of the things that you are discussing in some sense as an outsider, because these are fundamentally American issues, although not entirely. And I'm a Canadian, and we have our problems, but we don't have exactly the same problems that you have in the United States. And so I'm looking at this from the outside to some degree and trying to understand it. What is this set of assumptions in more detail that perturb you, and why let's start with that. What is this set of assumptions about about race relations in the U.S. that perturb you?
Well, there's one main assumption, which is that it's the job of the, shall we say, woke Black person to focus on racist obstacles to Black success and to purport that racism, be it social or systemic, is a conclusive obstacle to general Black success rather than an impediment that you can get around. And then there's an extension from that racism of both of those kinds is so oppressive that it's the defining experience of being a Black person. And so it means that if you are a Black person and you're writing, be it fiction or nonfiction or opinion, your focus is supposed to be always and forever racist oppression. Because if you're not doing that, you're not authentic and you're dissociating yourself from Blackness in some way. And I find that as a Montessori kid who has a lot of interests, I've always found that extremely confining. As soon as I hit adolescence, I realized, wow, I'm expected to be this racism-focused person maintaining a wariness of white socially that has not been necessary since about 5 years before I was born.
This is so interesting because normally people would instantly write this guy off as a Black conservative. But I think that's impossible because he talked about how his mother taught racism in school and how he agreed with it wholeheartedly. But it's just gone too far. And this is interesting because I wonder how uncomfortable progressives got if they watched this and what the mental gymnastics would be. Because I guarantee you, because I've been in the space of, I know the brain of a progressive racist. Okay, I understand it. There was a time where I would virtue signal. When I first started on TikTok, I didn't. I called people out for bullshit virtue signaling. And then I got roped into it. I don't know how I let myself get there. And then I came out of it, and then I went a little more conservative, and I got a little bit conservatively racist, not drastically to the right or to the left, but and then I finally hit my slingshot back, and I know that the way that people would look at this is go okay, this guy is he's a Black conservative. He says he's a Democrat, but he went to his conservative school, and he's well spoken, so he must have had a good upbringing. And there's almost this subconscious or subtextual argument that because he speaks well, that he's also not Black enough. Because that can be an issue in some impoverished Black areas where if somebody does speak well, they get invalidated for their Blackness. And there's a lot of infighting in Black spaces that's for instance, you shouldn't call a Nigerian person Black because they'll hit you. They get mad at you. It's happened to me before. When I was younger, my mom worked at White Castle, and I called a Nigerian person Black. They get very offended because there's also tension between what you will say Native Black Americans, which are people who were basically forced here, and non-Native Black during slavery, and non-Native Black Americans. Because non-Native Black Americans look down on Native Black Americans. And so it's just interesting to hear, because I do think that, of course, there is the obstacle of systemic racism or the historical impacts from that are still continuing today. But then on the other hand, how much does a positive mentality help you? I know that sounds weird, but there is a level of you can pick yourself up by your bootstraps sometimes in some capacity, not all the time. But it's almost like we forsake one for the other. It's not like anybody's saying listen, I know the struggle is difficult and there needs to be advocacy for change in a progressive way, but also you kind of have to deal with whatever particularly shitty situation you're in and do your best to rise out of it. Nobody's saying that. People are saying either pick yourself up by your bootstraps or systemic racism is this all-encompassing thing that will devastate Black people. And you see that by everything being called white supremacy nowadays. There is, again, systemic racism exists. You already know my take on that. But to say everything is white supremacy, it's a tone-deaf argument. I think that hurts the narrative in general. It gets a lot of people to tune out. And that was my big criticism with Jon Stewart's perspective on it, was that we can't keep a bunch of white people saying that 3 white people or 4 white people debating on racism is an incredible thing. it's just very interesting. It's a lot to come. I mean, at the end of the day, the outcome of this is that you should try to advocate for positive change. But honestly, as a white person, you would focus on a class issue, because there's really nothing you could do to deal with. Like, there are cultural issues in the Black community. Again, I think that part of it comes from obviously systemic racism, and I think that welfare is a form of it. Systemic racism, at least the way that our welfare works, and we need to reform it. But the best you could do is really like provide opportunity and focus on a class issue more than anything else as like a white person for the most part, because there's really not a whole lot you could do. I think that it's usually generally very disconnected to sit down and have like an in-depth conversation about like the Black experience in Black communities when there's no Black person available to contrast what you're saying. I don't think there's an issue with white people talking about Black shit or Black issues. Sorry, I got a little bit of my, what do you call it, vocal fry. But it's usually weird when you don't really talk to a Black person about it. You know what I mean? Especially one that's gone through a particular experience. But yeah.
And I think that it is a cloak that people put on because human beings seek comfortable cloaks to put on. It becomes a sense of being part of a tribe, but it has a way of departing from what reality actually necessitates. And I have just not been able to gracefully allow that sort of thing to define my life or to pretend to believe in those things. And so when I was around, how old am I when I start to pop? In my early 30s, I was at Berkeley. First was Cornell, then was Berkeley, then was the Manhattan Institute. And at UC Berkeley, there was a
reform it. How? What do you mean, like reform this like system? Like let's reform welfare. I've talked about it before. The implementation of a negative income tax that would replace welfare. Not instantaneously, you would be able to opt in. Like basically an Andrew Yang. I'm very big into like a universal basic income. I've shifted towards a negative income tax, which is basically just a universal basic income, but you only get money if you're like poor and middle class. Like the poorer you are, the more money you get. So like let's say you made $10,000 a year, you might get another $10,000 from the government. Let's say you made $20,000 a year, you might get like another $8,000 from the government, kind of a thing. Something along those lines. Like, and then maybe stop it at like $100,000, something along those lines. Something freer, something that allows people the individual choice to choose what they want to do with their money. Something that's non-conditional. It's one of the fears for people on welfare is that they might lose it if they get a job and they get opted. Like let's say you get a job and you start losing your benefits, it's hard to get back onto them. And so you got negative income tax would, even if you did really well and then you lost your money, you would go right back into the bracket to give you more money back. So it's not something that would be particularly like horribly harmful or damaging or terrible. And I think the conditionality is like a big issue. I know a lot of people are counter argument. There's nothing is 100% perfect, but they say like, well, what about people using money the wrong way? It's like, well, a lot of times people using money the incorrect way has to do with how much money they have available. Like I can go out and spend like $2,000 right now and none of you would criticize me because I have the money to do it. But obviously if you're poor and you do that, it's considered a bad decision, which obviously it is. You need to live within your means. But a lot of times it's more about the ability to recover from a bad decision helps you make less bad decisions in the future. Because like now you've been able to get a break. It's very much just like a cancel culture. Like when you do re-education culture, you allow people to recover from the bad thing that they said or did. They have a better chance in life. Same thing with providing people the ability to overcome bad decisions. Especially if you allow people to overcome bad decisions from an early age, they can make the decision go, oh, life's a little rough right now, but I know I'll recover. And they'll learn through experience and like negative interaction. Like a lot of people are like that. I have to touch a hot stove to know it's hot. You know, that's what I always say. And people are like that. A lot of people are like that. And so that's one of the defining issues, I think, when it comes down to like welfare.
The racial preferences were discontinued. The idea was that there were no longer going to be...
Yeah, right. It prevents marriages because people, it stops people from taking promotions. Yeah, like some people be like, we can't get married because I want to maintain benefits. And honestly, whether you want to hear it or not, but like just getting married, making like a lawful commitment, a lot of times will be something that binds people together. And you might argue that's like a better or worse thing. I would say that it's not like a horrible thing. Obviously, we have high divorce rates, but also at the same time, you know, for like that kind of a commitment, we know that the outcomes for the kids is just objectively better through data. Your kid's better off having both parents in their life, and you know, making that decision like I'm going to be with this person forever. That turns on a psychological switch for a lot of people. It's like, okay, you know what I mean? I think it's a very positive thing. I think it activates something in a lot of people of like loyalty and commitment and being with somebody. What we need to focus more on is teaching people to make sure that they choose the right person to be with you.
Different standards for allowing Black and Latino students to be admitted than white and Asian students. And the way this was talked about was as if all Black people are poor, as if the idea was that you don't change standards even for people who've grown up hard, when actually most Black students at Berkeley by then were very middle class and the problems were different. And I just couldn't remain silent. I remember the hardest thing for me was that there would be a white professor who would come and lean in my doorway and start, start, saying all of the usual pious sorts of things about race that I don't think truly cohere, such as implying that racism defines my entire existence. And I was expected to just sit there and nod. They really thought that any Black person thought that way. And I thought, no, you're missing me completely. Many Black people feel misread by whites. Well, I was having a different version of it. And I just got weary of it. And so I very circuitously and not as deliberately as many people think, I started writing about these things. I thought at first I was just going to put out 1.5 Yelps so that people would know how I felt and then go on being a linguist only. But for various reasons, that's not what happened. And here I am talking to you about.
Well, and you have this new book.
Woke racism.
Woke racism and how a new religion is betraying Black America. So, okay, so that's quite the title. I mean, I'm sure it was very carefully chosen. And Wikipedia informed me that you're formally atheistic, and so which may or may not be relevant to our discussion. But it's very interesting to me that you picked that as part of the title. Why do you believe that? Why this emphasis on a new religion? And what does that mean exactly?
Well, we're at a point where the kinds of beliefs that I'm talking about Black people, are no longer held as an opinion. It's at the point where a certain kind of person lives these beliefs in a way that is so impervious to any kind of reasonable discussion that you start to notice that it really is a matter of religion, in the sense particularly of Abrahamic religions, rather than opinion. And there are all sorts of things.
So what's the difference between religious belief and mere opinion in your estimation?
It is that many religions require that at a certain point you suspend disbelief and stop relying on conventional ratiocination and logic. There's a point at which you're supposed to have faith and believe in miracles of some sort. And it's at the point where when it comes to race, there are things that one is supposed to insist on and believe, regardless of whether they correspond to reality or even any sense of justice. One in Christianity is supposed to be dedicated to showing that you have faith in Jesus. Within the religion that I'm talking about, the cardinal point is that you show that you know that racism exists, just that you know that it exists. Now, what you're going to do about it is irrelevant. Whether or not what you're showing actually is racism is irrelevant. The fact is that you knew you were supposed to be looking for it. And only that imperative, as ding-dong as it sounds, explains a lot of the things that we've seen, especially lately. There's a real jump in the rails.
It's just so funny because he's taking shots he's virtue signaling at people. Yeah.
After summer 2020, but even
people
before that. And it means that a lot of people look at what goes on with the race scene in the United States. And I know to an extent, there is that in Canada too. Whenever you see these sorts of things happening and you see brilliant people making arguments that don't make any sense and utterly despising those who disagree with them as if they were heretics, word chosen deliberately, it's because what we're seeing, even though these are people who are usually very secular in their self-conception, it's a religion. This is exactly the kind of person who sent Galileo into exile a very, very long time ago. And the people back then often didn't think of themselves as religious. It was just considered truth. We're faced with that same kind of thought, even if the word isn't applied. And the reason I'm putting it that way is not just to annoy people by calling them religious, although I think it will annoy them. And it'll also annoy actual religious experts who will say that I'm stepping outside of my lane, which I most definitely am. But all of this stuff only makes sense if you realize that these people are religious and that they have to be treated as parishioners and not as people who are up for an argument.
I've had...
this is one of those things where we can't just say we tend to agree. I understand where he's coming from. I think it's very easy to lean into what he's saying because it's like a breath of fresh air. Because you tell that what he's saying is rooted in a level of logic, and I think that you have a lot of people ruining the conversation about race by virtue signaling and basically treating all Black people like fucking animals that just can't take care of themselves. And it's like a breath of fresh air to listen to somebody that's being reasonable about it. But I think that the difference between religion and Black issues is that Black issues are real. You know what I mean? And religion is real, but and God may be real. I'm agnostic, but all evidence points to him not being real. Which of course even hurts me to say because I am agnostic and it does conflict with my rooted religious ideology. To question the existence of God actually does contribute to an immense amount of fear and frustration, which might have just been something socialized into me. But we do have to understand that there is an objective truth to racism and systemic racism. It is objectively true. Now, obviously, you could argue that it doesn't exist anymore, but there still is that profoundly negative impact. And so, to me, it seems like a very complicated equation of how did we get here? How did we go from back in the 60s, the correct argument being portrayed by Black people to in the 2020s it going a little bit too far into everything must be a racial issue. And I don't know. I mean, I guess we could make a hypothesis. Part of that could be because like the general Black experience has gotten better, but there is like a level of historical trauma, which is effectively passing down teachings of like, the way that you need to interact with like society, like teaching like, oh, police are bad, kind of a thing. And like, those teachings may have continued onto some people who can't necessarily identify with the worst of the racism experience. It could just be a general frustration from Black people saying like, you're finally listening. It could be disingenuous white people amplifying the message and saying like, fuck off. It could be, or rather amplifying the message and just saying like, just the virtue signal and tokenizing the issue. And those white people going like, it doesn't matter what I say yes to, because it doesn't matter because Black people will never become in power. Right? Like a whole thing where we have this conversation about race, where it's like, okay, you can't be racist towards white people. And that takes like a very socioeconomic perspective on it, or like sociology, anthropology. And it makes sense to use that definition of the term racism when it comes to being in those studies, because those are the studies of society, of course. There's no reason to study the specific individual factor when it talks about that. So they compound the two, individual and systemic. Problem is people are trying to branch that over into the real world and say that like you cannot be racist towards white people. Now, systemically, that gets a little bit convoluted, because I actually do think to an extent you can be systemically racist towards towards a white person. Maybe that's not the right term. Maybe I'm defining this wrong, because we have two very rigid categories. But like, for instance, if you have like a Hispanic guy, like for instance, like my job, my foreman was Hispanic and he was a great guy, and he was in charge of hiring and firing in the for the mechanics. Well, just so you know, like 90% of the mechanics were Hispanic. Now, not that he did that intentionally. He may have done it subconsciously. But like, I would argue that could be a potential like systemically racist thing, where he's like disproportionately choosing people that like he feels represents him better, right? So like maybe in that capacity, but generally speaking, you can't be systemically racist towards white people. Individually, however, is very different. We shouldn't be looking at individuals in society through a systemic lens. It's bizarre, because if you did that, then every time you went to the store, you would let a Black person cut you in line at the grocery store and then get on your knees and do a BLM fist. It's honestly disrespectful to even, I mean, like if a Black person prompts you to talk about a race issue like a friend, that's totally fine. But to just look at a Black person and go Black race issue, and then to like, to what do you want to do? Have a race conversation? Black people, nobody likes to be treated differently. It's weird, So this is individually, yeah, you can be racist to anybody. Now, maybe as a Black person, you might have an experience with white people that makes you dislike them more, and so your racism might be more justifiable. That's fine, but it's still racist. And I think that the problem is that if we continuously set these double standards when it's like white people and everybody else, specifically when it comes to like racism, what happens when everything is balanced, which is the goal, right? Is the goal to balance everything. But we still have this idea that you cannot be racist towards white people. And so it just shifts in the other direction of like going from like trying to achieve equality to trying to reverse the oppression. And I can understand why you might want to reverse the oppression. You might be pissed off, but still, like we're talking about operating in the correct capacity. So, yeah.
A number of people make the same case to me recently, very profound people in my estimation. So I want to run a few ideas by you and see what you think. So I've thought a long time about the religious endeavor, let's say, from the psychological perspective, trying to unpack it. And it's related in some sense to the idea of depth. And so if you think about stories, literary stories, let's say, great works of literature for that matter, and lesser works, we all have this intuition that some stories are shallow, and they might be entertaining, but they're shallow, and some stories are deep. And we have the same sense in music for that matter. But so we have this natural sense of depth. And part of what that is related to is something like place in...
It's like a Darman video versus a Papa Gut video. You have the entertaining... non-depth video versus Papa Gut. Super entertaining as well, also very deep. Very attractive as well. All right, make sure you tell me that in the comments.
The axiomatic structure of propositional thinking. So something is deep if a lot of other things you think depend on it, and it's shallow if you can dispense with that and it doesn't do much to your underlying cognitive architecture. So does that seem reasonable so far?
Very much, yes.
Okay. And then I would say that there's a set of experiences that are universally human, more or less, that occur when our deeper beliefs are challenged, And that threatens the way that we construe the world and our ability to act in it. It threatens us with nihilism. It threatens us with chaos. It's no trivial matter. That happens often when heretofore separated cultures come into contact with one another.
Definitely.
So worlds can move when that occurs. Mm-hmm. Okay, so and then I would say that the set of emotions that are associated with the movement of deep beliefs are what we describe when we describe religious experience. Mm-hmm. And this is part of the reason I've had a number of conversations with famous atheists and very smart people. I mean, Harris, for example, is an extraordinarily smart person. And I'm familiar with Richard Dawkins' work and Daniel Dennett's work. These people are far from foolish, but they miss the point to me to some degree. Even scientifically speaking, because they treat religion as if it's a set of abstract propositions about the material structure of the world. And that's usually how the argument with religious people is framed. And they're often foolish enough to accept that initial framing. But there's a lot of phenomena that fall into the religious domain that have nothing to do with propositional truth. I mean, we already had a conversation about music, and music is often being used across many cultures for sacred purposes. And part of the reason for that is
I'm just going to skip ahead to the woke part. Hold on.
Versed in postmodernism.
Can you spell his last name?
Yeah, I'm going to skip ahead to the next. So this is where they talk about wokeism and postmodernism, because here's this music theory, like gay.
In the West, rather late in the game, that you sit and clap. Usually people are more involved every performance, but that's even more the same thing that we're talking about. The idea that you're a passive audience is something that happens particularly in the West, rather late in the game, that you sit and clap. Usually people are more involved. Everybody is, but that is even more of what you're talking about. Yeah, I would say that those things are real. And in a sense, and I'm not just trying to yank it back to woke racism to push the book, but I'm really thinking about this. My book is about people. It's actually, I'm known for saying things black people don't like. A lot of black people aren't going to like woke racism, but woke racism is going to be hated by a lot of white people too. The woke person I'm really thinking about in that book is a white guy. And the white guy in that case is not somebody who I can hate, because I do see that there is a benefit.
So is he saying that the target of his book is woke racism, like against other or white people rather than black? Interesting. Okay.
Fit that a person gets to this religion, even when it doesn't necessarily make, if we may pardon the term, sense. The person can't help it. I see where they're coming from and they frustrate me often. But it worries me that because religion is, let's call it for our purposes here, a different kind of reality, it can conflict with what an oppressed group needs in order to be most comfortable and happy in a complex society.
Well, so let's talk about that for a minute. Now, one of the things you told me earlier on was that I think, and I don't want to put words in your mouth, absolutely. So if I've got this wrong, please correct me. Mm-hmm. It seemed to me that you were implying, if not outright stating, that the collectivist ethos of much of that discourse was interfering with your self-regard as an individual, but even more importantly, your ability to manifest yourself, appear as, and be treated as an individual. And so we're looking here, at least to some degree, for what might constitute a reasonable uniting principle. And
it's so interesting to listen to the way that Jordan Peterson does piece together information, because that is what he was just saying. It's yeah, people viewed me through this lens of being black to an extent where I was less than, based on my experience in the world, and I needed to be helped up as a fucking animal. You know what I mean? That's the way that I think that some progressive street black people. And that was obviously frustrating because you were more than just your particular identity, your skin identity.
One of the reasons that I've been opposing the collectivist thought that's characteristic of the insistence that group identity is the primary phenomenon, say socially and morally, more importantly, is that it's the wrong uniting principle. The right uniting principle is the divinity of the individual, to speak in religious terms. And we can strip that of its religious significance and say, well, part of it is that the proper level of analysis for political discourse is...
What's interesting to me, because people are criticizing him because he's just using big words. What this is to me is Jordan Peterson's thinking out loud. This is the way that your kid thinks out loud. I do it too. Sometimes I will just talk to my wife about something, and I'm not really I'm talking to her. And I want her to understand me, and I want her to validate what I'm saying. But it's me going through constructing a logical path based on my morale system. And that's what I think he's doing right now, because it sounds like he's just re-explaining everything. But I think that's him trying to understand more than anything else.
Is predicated on the sanctity of the individual. Mm-hmm. And so we need to get serious as a culture about whether or not we actually believe this and what the relationship between that belief and reality actually is. So
that's hard. because as you know, you're far ahead of this, far ahead of me on this. It's hard to be an individual. It's not natural. It's not, I don't think it's what we're hardwired for. It's a rather new concept. And many people spontaneously will say they want to be an individual. I think to an extent, though, that's fashion. And to most people, group identity is...
I love this guy. He's shitting on everybody. He's talking about people who talk about being like individualists or just like are like quirky. They're just like, oh, I'm quirky. Oh, I'm like they're just like people are identifying with their individuality in the same way that people will identify with like a particular ID. Wow, the word escapes me. Identity, really, like in group. You know, like it's like, oh, well, you're just saying that you are an individual as a way to be unique in the way that some people, not all people, identify as non-binary. There are obviously valid non-binary people, but some people just say it just to be part of an in-group. And it's just like this in-group of individuals, this lone wolf in-group almost. If you look at it like that, you get it more, right? It's like, I'm a lone wolf, part of a lone wolf pack, you know? But you're saying you're a lone wolf. And, you know, anyway, I'm not even going to respond to that comment. What the fuck was I saying? Yeah, you just threw me off with that fucking comment. You say, okay, so you say like Ryan. I don't think Ryan Beard identifies as non-binary in a disingenuous performative way. Like I think that I honestly think that Ryan Beard probably has issues based on like the way that he probably has issues based on some like discomfort based on something, and it's manifesting through like a gender identity. You know, it's probably like a self-esteem issue to some extent.
What gives them a sense of purpose. And that's the way human beings have always been. And it's hard to really make a person realize being an individual means that it's really just you. For example, many very smart Black people, I think, are under the impression that being an individual means that you have the bravery to stick your fist up and battle racist attitudes. But the problem is that is now a group activity. That's something that lots and lots of other people are doing. It only may seem a little bit unusual to a very naive white person looking on or subject to it. And so the question is, how do you really feel?
Interesting. Wait, hold on.
A bit unusual to a very naive activity. To stick your fist up and battle, I think, are under the impression that being an individual means that you have the bravery to stick your fist up and battle racist attitudes. But the problem is that is now a group activity. That's something that lots and lots of other people are doing. It only may seem a little bit unusual to a very naive white person looking on or subject to it. And so the question is, how do you really feel?
I wonder what form of racism he's talking about. Is he, because I'm sorry, I'm doing what Jordan Peterson's doing. I'm going to think out loud. I'm going to speak out loud. What it sounded like he was saying was that there's some very intelligent Black people who are taking a stand against like woke racism, like leftist racism. And they're speaking up and saying like, hey, this is a bad thing. But they're doing that in a way where they're identifying as an individual fighting against like the pack. But what his argument is that like, no, that's actually more normal than we would realize, is that like a lot of Black people apparently are saying like, this is fucking stupid. And to an ignorant white person who hears like a lot of like very like, you know, racism type speech, of course, some of it's valid. They think that there's like every Black person, the collective Black experience is like this, like everything is racism, when it's not necessarily the collective Black experience. Interesting.
Feel about these things. If you want to battle racism, how would you like to do it, as opposed to adopting certain mantras and battle cries? But mantras and battle cries are what we human beings do. We do it together. That's hard.
True.
That's a tough thing, because individualism might not be the way that humanity needs to go. I personally would prefer it. That's my sense. And that's your sense, I think. But I think a very coherent case could be made that particular conception of marching to the beat of your own drummer is an eccentricity that
Yeah, you shouldn't do that. That's how we have like fucking ska music. Terrible fucking like what is it called? Not ska. Like punk music. To march to the beat of your own drum. It's terrible. The music is just bad. Okay. At least traditional punk. It's meant to be bad. Like, that's the whole point of it.
And solitary-minded people,
because they're bad at drumming. That was the joke. So.
Came to cherish amidst industrialization over a certain 200 or 300 years. I don't know if I could refute that.
Okay, so I think that's an extremely astute objection. Let's say, especially the observation that, and you touched on this earlier, that requirement for group identification is deeply embedded in the substructure of human consciousness. So let's say, well, we want to have friends. We want to have a family. We want to have a town or something like that, a community of 200, right? Embedded in a town. I think the question isn't or the issue isn't so much the fact that the idea that the individual is the uniting principle should supplant that. It's that should be organized underneath that in some, because it isn't an issue of the absence of the necessity for group identity, because without that we couldn't do anything together, and wouldn't that be a catastrophe?
Right, yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And so that has to be recognized, and I do think, to give the woke types, and even if it's a religious manifestation, their due, if that does produce a sense of cohesive group identity, then you can understand the longing for that in a fractionated community that in some sense has got too psychologically large. So that has to be contended with. But I do really see, because I viewed the culture wars in the university, I really believe they're battling out something extraordinarily deep. This isn't a surface issue. Part of the debate, and this emerged out of France, the French intellectual tradition fundamentally, as far as I'm concerned, is the question of what level of conception should be primary. And the assault on the patriarchy and on, there's more to it than that, is part of an assault on the idea of individuality and the truth that individuals hold in their language. It's an assault on all of that. It's a deep, deep criticism. And I think it's incredibly dangerous, but I understand why it arose. And so
definitely.
And I was curious about you, because you said at the beginning that even though your mother had taught you, in some sense, these woke precepts, there was something in you that rebelled against it.
Yeah,
what was that?
I don't think that he said that. I don't think that he necessarily. I don't think he said that at all. I don't think that he said that. I disagree. I don't think that Jordan interpreted what he was saying correctly, and I think that it's a bit too ignorant for this conversation, right? Because like stuff. Okay, and he's not. It sounds like he's not going to press him on it. Let me see.
Yeah, it's not. I don't rebel against the idea that, for example,
he is.
There is.
Yeah, because he said that like his mother taught him like racism and a lot of racist speech that he wholeheartedly agrees with. He just feels like it's going too far now. And Jordan was like, "Oh, you address." He just kind of like grouped all advocacy, or I guess what you would say, like all. I don't want to say wokeism, because I think that's like stupid. He grouped all of like the we'll say for the sake of argument, the correct aspect of the racism argument with the new age argument about it, that like everybody, black people are a monolith, etc. But he made sort of to distinguish those two things, that like he is still a left, or he's still, like a progressive, he's a Democrat. He never voted Republican. He believes that there's black issues that are impacting black Americans. He just doesn't like to identify with the newer age idea that everybody's a victim and nobody can overcome their experience. That's what he had said.
Is institutional racism. I don't think it should be called that, but there are inequities in society between, say, black and white that are due to racist attitudes, usually in the past, and racist biases and racist lookings past. All of those things are definitely true. There are all sorts of things in Black history that have helped to set us back that one should certainly know about. One should know about the redlining of neighborhoods where in many cities, most Black people lived in neighborhoods where banks would not give you a loan. All of these things are very real. I never felt like I rebelled against that. What I rebelled against was the idea that you base your whole sense of identity upon those things, such that you live a life that's abbreviated because you're exaggerating how bad it still is, and you're distorting what's necessary to create dignified lives for Black people. And my feeling's always been, you probably have about 80 years. You're lucky if you've got 80 years. And if you spend your whole life maintaining, in my time period, the same battle poses in the 80s and 90s that people needed in the 50s and 60s. After a while, you've spent your life play acting, and then you die and the world goes on. What I rejected was the exaggeration. And so, for example, I remember if there was one moment where I realized there was something wrong with me, it was in the wake of the Rodney King trial in 1991. And a lot of Black people I liked very much were united in saying, what happened to Rodney King shows that a Black man can't get justice in this country. And I remember thinking, no, that statement would have made sense in about 1965 and in many American cities, 1975. And there were islands of it even in 1991. But the idea that as a 20-something Black person, you were living in a country where you just couldn't get justice, it struck me as beyond rhetoric, especially given the general attitude they had towards what being Black meant then, as we were standing around at Stanford University, a campus where all of us had been evaluated according to adjusted standards out of the idea that we were really wanted on that campus, et cetera, that we were supposed to still be speaking that language that the Black Panthers had spoken. It struck me as a pose. And there was a part of me that was deeply disturbed by the artificiality of it, and that you were actually expected to live it.
Why the okay,
so interesting. It's a lot. And it's very particularly interesting to me is a concept we've been talking a lot about, which is like individual. I haven't really come up with like a word for it. There's probably a word for it, but I just personally, but just the the concept that an individual's internal idea of themselves and internal experience is something that like they have to basically wholeheartedly regulate to an extent. And let me give you like, and it's hard to question it. Let me try to give you an example because it's very new to me. So I'm sorry I'm not being like super concise. But for instance, like people that are on the internet, they say like, oh, I have ADHD. Or, I'm quirky, I have ADHD, or I'm non-binary. Some people, not all non-binary people. I'm sorry for going too hard, and it's not all non-binary people, but they'll say that they have this experience that for all we know, they just don't. We don't really know. There's no way to actually tell 100% what if they're expressing a valid experience. And I'm someone with ADHD. But you don't really know based on me saying that. Now, if you're some kind of like a behavioral expert, you might be able to sit here and break it down. But the reality is that you can't really know a lot of these things because this person, it's hard to turn those down. And so when it comes to like this speech is one of those things where it's like this idea that like the outside forces can be oppressing you, but then also your own inside forces can be oppressing you. And if you believe that you're oppressed to an extent, like who really knows? Like, are you? I mean, I know I'm sure that there are Black people who have conversations about race that personally can't identify with the experience of like being oppressed, and they still present themselves as if they do. And that can be a very difficult idea to overcome. Some people probably do it because they've been told that they're oppressed, and it's like a self-fulfilling prophecy. But I think that some Black people, identify with it as a way to say, like, well, I'm oppressed, so I have this experience, but they don't necessarily have that experience. You know, like that would be like if Candace Owens said, like, I have the typical Black experience, which I think that she tries to say and says that it's not so bad. She's like, I have the typical Black experience, it's not so bad. She grew up not wealthy. I think she grew up poor. But she grew up poor in like Connecticut, so she had access to like decent schooling and whatnot. And so you can't say that that's necessarily, or that might be the typical Black experience. I don't know, but that's not the same experience as like growing up in like the South in an area that's constantly being hit with like gerrymandering from Republicans and stuff. You know, so it's just very interesting because it's very difficult to tell if somebody's telling the truth, and even if they aren't, like, do they know that they might be lying to themselves? It's just a very deep conversation. I mean, obviously, you generally shouldn't be like, I'm going to question your identity. But you know.
So you use very specific words. Oppose, artificial, as opposed to what? Like on what base? Like you're comparing it to something,
Sure.
and it sounds like you're comparing it, and you don't just regard it as an exaggeration. Your criticism has gone farther than that in the past. I mean, you've also directly stated that conceptualization of the problem in this form is actually interfering with the solutions that we still need to generate. So it's not just an exaggeration; it's a problem in and of itself, and that's a deeper criticism. So
I wonder what the fuck Jordan Peterson's doing right now, because this guy's point is pretty clear. It's that like he believes like there's systemic racism exists, but he thinks that some people are exaggerating the experience, and we've made progress. And every time he says that, this is the second time. Jordan Peterson, the first time, misrepresented what he was saying by saying that like all wokeism is bad, whatever. Kind of like wrapping in systemic racism in with that. And then after expressing this, Jordan Peterson's like on this tangent about how like, oh, you've expressed that it's worse and worse. It just feels weird. Like the way that Jordan Peterson's talking about this feels like bizarrely. Maybe it's difficult to like articulate, but it feels like he's like pushing a narrative almost, like an internalized narrative that like maybe the problem's worse than it is, or that like maybe even systemic racism doesn't exist. I wonder, it just feels off to me.
What's the artificiality as far as you're concerned, and compared to what?
Yeah,
what you're trying to live, apparently, but what is that exactly?
The question is, how much of an obstacle is racism after formal segregation has been battled, after racial attitudes changed profoundly in the 1970s? And I'm just old enough to have watched that happen. Just it gets to the point where, okay, racism does exist, both social and institutional, but how much of an obstacle is it to doing pragmatic things that will make poor Black people less poor and all Black people happier? So a quick example would be that these days you can look at the fact that Black kids tend not to do as well on standardized tests as other kids. It's there. Now, you can look at that and you can say, well, if Black kids don't do as well on the test, that's because of racism. And so we need to eliminate the test because the test is racist.
Yeah, it's so fucking stupid. If anything, you should just provide like more resources to help those kids have a better time in school.
Now, in what way is the test racist? 40 years ago, maybe those tests asked you what wine goes with chicken. That hasn't been true for generations now. So it's not about asking.
That was fucking funny. What wine goes with chicken? What a weird shot at white people for like their fucking food habits. I don't know. What the fuck? That's so funny. That was fucking hilarious.
People things that they
What's
have
going
no
on,
reason to
brother?
know. How is it racist? And there are people today who even will imply that black thought is somehow incompatible with tests like that, which is very close to saying that black people are incapable of disembodied abstract thought.
Yeah, it's just saying that black people are held to you're saying that black people in that instance, you're saying that black people are less than white people. You're setting a difference between black and white people. It's just not true. Black people don't interpret information like so vastly differently or at all. There have been studies done where like black and white people grow up together and they come out effectively the same. Like everybody's an individual, so individually might be a little bit different, but they come out the same. So to suggest that is racist. Honestly, it's insane. It's insanity. And I've seen black people talk about that before. It's like, what the fuck is wrong with you? If anything, again, there probably need to be more resources provided. There might be a cultural aspect there as well, because like I remember, like there might be an aspect of listen, I'm aware that to an extent in some black communities that if a black kid tries to do well, they get kind of shamed for it. And so maybe there's an aspect of that in there, of like a self-fulfilling prophecy. If I can't succeed, maybe there's an issue with like broken homes, which is disproportionately more of an issue in black communities, and again due to systemic racism. Because I imagine you see these same phenomena happen to white people, just not as like largely or collectively, because black people are disproportionately on welfare and whatnot. Again, we already know. I don't have to police my language now. Like I'm trying not to. I don't want to. Obviously, it's one of those conversations where you walk on eggshells, and so I imagine there might be a cultural aspect to it. And like is it as simple as coming from systemic racism? Is there an issue of like, do we give the schools more money to make the schools better, or do we need to make the lives better of parents? You know what I'm saying? Like, if you can't, like a lot of parents will help their kids with homework. Maybe if you're having to work so much because you live in like a poor area, maybe you can't have the opportunity to do that. If you have welfare in a community that advocates for you not to get married, maybe you have less of an incentive to stay with the person that you're with because it might be conditional welfare. There's just so many different things. And my only reason I say that is because I've always been a lot of people have this idea when it comes to the solutions in particular areas is like, okay, we need to make schools better. We need to put more money into schooling. We need to collect our taxes and we need to put it into better schools. We need to put it into more social service programs. We need to provide more like, we'll say like food stamps. Maybe we can invest some of that into like black owned businesses, or like, helping people do startups, a lot of these different things. I don't agree with this because I feel like what we're doing fundamentally is saying, here's our pool of money. Let's tell people how they should spend it. Whereas I come more from like a school of thought of like, okay, let's say we have this pool of money and we just give it to black people or poor people really. But in this instance, we just give it to black people. And then black people, now the one thing missing from here is when you put all this money into schooling and social services and food stamps and whatnot, is I don't think that this necessarily dumps a lot of money into the system. It doesn't necessarily give people individually money to spend in the system so that it can circulate. And that's what we need to do. You give money to black people, what are they going to go do? They're going to spend money like everybody else. You're going to spend more money. You're going to have more money. You're going to feel more comfortable. You're going to buy basic things. You're going to have better living conditions. All of a sudden, when it comes to school, well, if you're giving people money, guess what? Teachers are also now getting money. Some hot take, some black people are teachers, but also we're talking about poor people in general. So teachers get more money right off the bat just because of some kind of like a UBI or a negative income tax. Right. And so you satisfy that. Social services, the desire and the need for social services will go down because like why do you need social services? Usually because people have a difficulty managing their own life. There is a direct correlation between being poorer and being less intelligent. Specifically in the profound amount of stress that comes along with being poor. They've done studies on this where like farmers in season when they were making, or out of season, I don't know which one, but when they were making a lot of money, they had like their IQ points were like 12 points higher when they were so financially stressed because like it weighed on their minds, their IQ went down. And so we have that, but then of course the school experience will increase your IQ as well, but then we'll have a less of a desire for social or need for social services because also whether you want to hear it or not, being poor is going to increase like domestic abuse because like when you're poor and frustrated all the time, it makes you a more angry person. And I know it might be uncomfortable to talk about abusers in a way where like they may be a victim of circumstance, but that is just the reality of life. then you already have money going into black-owned businesses because like you're literally giving everybody money. Let's say we gave like everybody $1,000 a month. So like now you're a business owner. You have a salary, which is unheard of. Black-owned business owners do not, like, business owners don't get salaries like the first 5 years, I think they say. Something along those lines. Now you have a salary. Well, guess what? Now you can also pay minimum wage instead of like increasing the minimum wage. You pay minimum wage, which means it's cheaper for you. Why can you do that? Well, because your employees are also making that $1K a month. So you don't, their wages are being subsidized. On top of that, more people, everybody else is making $1K a month too. So now you're going to have a higher chance of having more business, right? And so now you have money cycling through the community, going through it over and over and over again, and this makes a healthier economy. And then what do you do next? Well, when you've propped yourself up financially, what can you do? Well, you can say like, hey, you know what I want to do? I think I would like to increase my taxes and do more property taxes. Yes, people do that. Hey, we have more money. We can start increasing our property taxes so that we can give that to schools. That can go to the school experience. To me, this makes more sense than this. Give money to people, because at the end of the day, people can act irresponsibly. But like we said before, people will act more responsibly the more of a breathing room they have. Give it to the individual, and then they can make the decision on what they need in their community. And it might take some time. Nothing's perfect, but I feel like this is a better way, rather than to try to provide all these other services, which I don't necessarily think are going to be impactful. Give it to people, because you know one of the reasons some kids might not be going to school is because their parents don't give a shit about them, and maybe that has to do with the fact that like the parent doesn't have a lot of money, and then they you know what I mean? Like there's so many different factors here, and it feels like this makes the most sense. This I feel like makes the most sense, because also I think that this touches on more than this does. Giving money directly to people touches on something that nobody else really likes to talk about, and that is just rebuilding government trust. There is, like, in black communities, a distrust of the government, of the police, justifiably so. A lot of it's like a historical passing down. You call that historical trauma. And this is I don't know. I feel like this would be seen as more psychologically like impactful, because you probably get more money as an individual, right? That will that directly impact you positively. And maybe some communities will start to think like, wow, maybe the government gives a shit about us. Maybe we can start identifying as American again because the government fucking cares about us. Rather than micromanaging and saying like, oh, well, you're too fucking stupid to understand what you need, so we're going to put money into blah, 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 blah. And then it's like, well, is that going to have like this profoundly positive impact? Like, do we know necessarily? Or for the best bang for your buck argument is really what I'm going for. I would rather give money directly to people. So, you know, sorry for going on a tangent, but.
And many whites will chime in.
It's probably identical with that claim.
Yeah, it's very unfortunate. How's it racist? And there are people today who even will imply that black thought is somehow incompatible with tests like that, which is very close to saying that black people are incapable of disembodied abstract thought. And many whites will chime in.
It's probably identical with that claim.
Yeah, it's very unfortunate, especially given that the people who are saying it know very well the history of that being said about black people. And so you look at the test and you say that because
it's incredible. That's like a leftist talking point. Like you come full circle. Conservatives used to say black people were like a different breed that weren't intelligent. Now leftists are saying it. Some leftists are saying it now too. But it sounds woker because it's talking about standardized tests. Isn't that fucking incredible?
Because black kids don't do well on them. They are examples of systemic racism. Well, you have to get rid of racism, so you have to get rid of the tests, which means that you tell America that black kids can't have their abstract reasoning measured without it being racist. And then when you get somebody saying, well, then black kids just must not be as quick on the uptake, you call them a racist. And in the meantime, it's ignored that you consider helping black kids get better at the tests, helping black kids' parents realize what free test prep programs there are in those neighborhoods. The tests just take a little bit of practice, but you're not supposed to talk about it because the tests, quote unquote, are racist.
I will say something. Fundamentally, I feel like SATs are kind of shitty. I mean, you know, it's racist to exclude one person from it or one group of people from it. But like, I feel like in school, a lot of times people learn to take the test more than they learn what's on the test, if that makes sense. And I feel like that's a fundamental problem in general.
It's an abuse of language, and it's abuse of the very conception of what racism is. That's not what my mother raised me in. That's not your grandmother's racism. That's something that comes from a way of thinking that was marginal in 1955, became sexy in about 1966, and here in 2021 is being treated as impregnable wisdom. Someone black has to speak out against that. So that's what I mean by the exaggeration and the artificiality and the outright harm that comes from these sorts of things.
Unfortunately, he'd probably be like denounced for his blackness if he said that to a lot of people, at least online, like a lot of like woke individuals, you know?
Well, and with regard to it being a pose, so is it a pose of? So I could say, well, is it a pose of unearned virtue? I mean, virtue is not easy to earn. True virtue. You have to establish. Let's say we'll see where we go with this. Maybe you have to establish a relationship with beauty, and beauty is real. You have to establish a relationship with truth, and truth is real. And so to earn virtue is difficult because beauty and truth are imposing and formidable. If you have any sense at all, you see that. And so that's a daunting task to establish genuine virtue, and a terrifying task. And is the pose the willingness to adopt? See, because when I talk to the ideologue types, and maybe that happened most famously with an interview I had with, I think it was
Helen. Just thinking about it.
Mm-hmm.
You mean Michael Eric Dyson, right? Yeah.
Oh, I wasn't thinking about Dyson. I was thinking about a GQ interviewer, and that interview's been watched like 40 million times now. It's this ideological pose is the aping of virtue, as far as I can tell. And I mean that in sort of a technical sense, is that you master this language, and it can...
SSB has just resubscribed for 2 months. Among Us Earl.
Among Us Earl in real life. Thank you so much, brother. I appreciate it.
Contains the expressions of true virtue. But, the kind of problems that you were talking about, and I see this on the environmentalist side of things too. Well, how do you get black kids to do better in elementary school, let's say? Well, that's a more manageable problem. It's a problem that would take a little bit more humility to conceptualize. And it's also a really, really hard problem. And so to be virtuous in your...
One way you could do that is like universal preschool. Preschool sets you up for success in an incredible way. So
attempts to solve that would probably require the dedication of your entire life, really, to take a good crack at that problem, right? Because that's a tough problem, man. And so maybe you don't want to do that and then you're enticed by your educators into this alternative possibility where all you really have to do is master a set of propositions and you're on the winning side. And that also gives you some convenient enemies, and maybe it fulfills to some degree the religious instinct. And it appalls me to see the universities complicit in this. And that they've come to see that.
So what he's saying is basically like, instead of actually having to discover that problem, most people probably know what I'm talking about, but in order to discover the problem of how to like get kids to do better in elementary school, rather than actually doing the tough thing and doing that, instead they just learn some verbiage that sounds very virtuous and woke, and they expel it, and then people criticize them. But then those people that are criticizing them makes them look good by comparison, because like, look at that fucking idiot. And a lot of times, it's basically like the trans women in sports debate conversation going on. It's that like people are spouting a bunch of like virtuous bullshit on the left about how like trans women should be in sports and how there's no difference, even though that's been like every study that's done, like it shows that there definitely will be a maintenance. Like they did studies on just in general. It takes years. Like I think even after 3 years, you haven't gone down to like the hormone levels of a cisgender woman. There's a whole bunch of shit. Fuck, I lost my thought. My wife said something in the chat. I'll read in a second. Anyway, yeah, right. So in the case of that, conservatives have always been anti-trans. It doesn't matter what the fuck you could say. You could just be like, hey, I think that trans women should exist, and you're just like, no, I disagree. Trans women are they're just dumb. That's what conservatives will say. And so like now you say this virtuous speak, and what does it get contested by? People who've historically been fucking transphobic. And so this is what's happening. So those are convenient enemies. When Ben Shapiro contests you specifically as a leftist person or a left-leaning person, somebody with a left ideology, you come out looking good to your side because, well, Ben Shapiro's always been transphobic. So now I'm sure he's making the same argument about trans people in sports, trans women at least. Now he's saying that like he's been 9.9 times out of 10 he's wrong on trans shit. When it comes to trans issues. So now he's right, but it doesn't matter because like it's very easy to pull a virtuous win. And so like this is what they're talking about. This is how these things like manifest themselves, is that you have people who've historically just been dumb fucks talking about particular issues. No offense if you're transphobic, but also full offense. Come by the stream, I'll educate you. You have people who've historically just been transphobic, and now there's one time where they're right, accidentally probably. And all of a sudden, boom, it doesn't matter. And that's kind of how this back and forth manifests itself.
And I think part of that falseness and artificiality that you described, I think the fact that exists is part of the like overbearing insistence that the veil not be lifted and that no one question this, because what is underneath it is so damn ugly.
Yeah. Jordan, you have nailed something. I would be loath to go so near that word virtue, because the last thing I want to do is imply that somebody isn't virtuous. Nevertheless, you're getting it in that it's an unearned virtue which people are settling for, not because they're so callow as to wish to be virtuous without earning their stripes, but because religion is attractive. And so if you are surrounded by people who are brandishing this message that everything that you don't like is racist and you can get beyond it that way, it's not that you're lazy, it's not that you're trying to get stripes that you didn't earn, but it's comfortable, because part of being in that religion is that there's an us versus them conception, which is very comforting. You're part of a mission of uplift, which is very comforting.
It's also very difficult to critically think and engage in things. So, or not even that's necessarily. I mean, it is difficult, but it's also not desirable. Like, I love it. I love sitting down and critically thinking, and I think that's a phenomenal way. Just every day testing. You have your days where you're just testing your moral code versus the world, and your ability to try to stay like logically and morally consistent. I found it really interesting, and it's incredible. Most people don't like that; it's too difficult for them, and so a lot of times they just tune out and they go with whatever seems like the right thing to do. And it's actually very interesting now that they're bringing it up, because you can't really expect people to think critically all the time. Not everybody has the time for it, or maybe there's people who aren't necessarily built for it. Just some people are smarter than others. I think that inherently, or maybe it has like an upbringing thing where you weren't tested enough in school, or this, that, and the other thing. I tended to be like a contrarian a lot, so I'd always contest everything all the time. And sometimes I think that maybe every once in a while I find myself doing that unintentionally, but I try to maintain like reasonable focus. And so like you educate, you learn based off the world. I feel like a lot of people don't have the ability, capacity, or time to do that. If you're working a 60-hour work week, especially, let's say you're like a truck driver and you're working every day and you're working like 12-hour days and you're fucking killing yourself. And do you think that when you get home, you're going to have time to sit down and have like a critical conversation about anything? No, of course not. What you're going to do is you're going to balance your life experience against what somebody else is saying. That's their job, like a politician. Like, you're going to be like, okay, this is my life experience. I can't articulate why I feel a particular way, which is okay. It's a normal human experience. But this person is somebody that I identify with, so I'm going to go with what they're saying. And that's the problem. It's not the people though. It's the politician, right? It's the person that's expressing for them. In some instances can be very wrong. But a lot of times people just say, I'm going to identify with that person. They're saying what I like to say, right? And so that's why it's more important to have conversations on on a wider range. Because if you could ever convince Ben Shapiro that trans people are valid, a lot of people who liked Ben Shapiro will hate him now, but also those people a lot of other people will be like, oh wow, maybe trans people are valid. You know what I mean? And so that's the best way to really interact, is to change the mind of somebody who is a thought leader in a particular group. Or even if it's not instantaneous, even if it takes a little bit of time, that's your best way of operating.
And in a university, that religion is there. It's as if they're, people from a church who are behind tables out in the plaza who are waiting to recruit people. That's there as soon as you hit campus. And so that's why so many people, and now it's not just black kids, it's also white kids, fall for this way of looking at things, where what it is you become virtuous without having done the sorts of things that ideally one might have. You're virtue signaling, and it is unearned virtue, but it's because you wish to have a cloak. You're seeking a comfort zone. I can't hate anybody for that, but it does mean an awful lot of mendacity. That's the problem.
So I wasn't
I got to look at other virtue signaling white fucks and go like, maybe you're trying, but you're just wrong.
trying to imply too that all objections to that process are in and of themselves virtuous. And I'm also not trying to imply that I'm somehow especially virtuous. I'm actually quite terrified by the proposition that virtue is something real and something necessary, and that falling short of it is cataclysmic in some sense existentially. And so anyone who doesn't tremble at such a thought hasn't thought about it very deeply. And I want to have as much sympathy as possible, especially for young people who are enticed into this ideological identification, because you can...
Okay, I think there's a ghost.
Look, I was a committed socialist when I was 16, and on intellectual grounds. I mean, talent is distributed equally amongst the human population, yet there are inequities in society. So how can that be anything but unfair? Well, fair enough. The answer to that is extremely complicated, but the problem announces itself, and you can certainly see how someone with
what does mendacity mean? I have no fucking idea. I'll look it up. I don't know what he's talking. I mean, I don't think I missed anything. Let's see. It means untruthfulness. Okay, there you go.
Compassionate bent, and even with an intellectual bent of sorts, would be deeply attracted.
Sorry, the ghost is distracting me.
By the extremely well-honed arguments that have been put forward in favor of all those propositions. So,
or it can be even more primitive than that. I think that tribalism in and of itself is deeply attractive, and that this is something that can happen regardless of intelligence level. I remember in college, I wasn't a socialist, but I definitely hated Republicans until I met some. And, I couldn't have told you during most of the time when I was in college what the difference between a Republican and a Democrat even was. I was busy doing other things, and it was easier not to know. There was no internet. But I knew that those Republicans, who were usually guys, it was usually a few guys with their own corner room down the hall, you didn't like them because they were Republicans, and Ronald Reagan was bad because he was white and he dyed his hair or something like that. That was enough, even for the smarter kids who were smoking cigarettes out.
Didn't Ronald Reagan ruin the economy?
In front of the dorm. That would do. I met Republicans as time went on and realized that, wait a minute, I'm not one of them, but I can't see them as insane. But before that had happened, I was very happily against a whole group of people who I knew nothing about. I don't think I was unique in that.
No, not at all. Okay, so maybe, if you don't mind, maybe we could close with this, because I'm starting to get tired and I'm not going to make much sense soon. So if assuming I have so far, so I've been considering this proposition that's emerged from the woke end of the political spectrum. Let's say that all white people are racist, and I think, okay, are all white people racist? What's the answer to that? And the answer is yes and no, and how dare you frame the question like that? That's the three.
Interesting. I mean, fucking Christ. I don't know. Okay. See, here's my problem is that, like, everybody's very racist. Everybody's very tribalistic, very based, right? Everybody's very tribalistic in and of themselves. And a lot of people are very racist, and they're like sexist, and they're homophobic, and even people who might think that they're not tend to be in some kind of like a, subconscious way that they don't even understand. And I think that's important to understand that, like, all of us we are all privy to our own prejudices, and we should all actively try to be aware of them, and the way that we talk, and the way that we speak, and the way that we interact with different people that come from different places. At the same time, I think that calling all that racism or bigotry, I think that's stupid. And the reason is because if everything is racist, then what does racism mean? And we can understand that there's a spectrum of racism, but I feel like you could sit here and be like, here's a spectrum of racism that goes like left and it's right, and this is racism. That says pacism, but this is racism, and this is the whole thing is racist. But to me, like, what the fuck is the point? How do you really make any distinguish between, like, somebody who might, like, see a black person and just, like, tense up a little bit without even realizing it, versus somebody who actively joined the KKK, right, on the opposite side? And so, like, it's better, I think, to look at racism on more of a spectrum of, like, okay, this would be better to be like racism. This is better to be race. And that spectrum, obviously, KKK still sits here. And then down here is, like, pearl clutching without realizing it, But maybe here is racism, and here this is actually racism, and maybe this isn't racism. Maybe this is just like ignorance, Maybe this is just more racial ignorance, and this is just a lack of understanding of particular things, When somebody pearl clutches because they're like, oh my god, I'm afraid, and it's like, okay, well, why do you do that? Is that necessarily racist? Is that active? Is that hatred, or is that some kind of a fear based on a stereotype that's been perpetuated, either through like the hyperbolic, like maybe conservative media, or maybe due to like a history of systemic racism, and you know what I mean? And so I feel like that's not a good way to. I don't think that this makes the most sense to display racism. I think that if everything's just racist, you get like you have to elevator pitch everything in your life. If your elevator pitch is everything is racist, I'm tuning out. Most people are going to tune out. Messaging is just as important as the message. If I sat here and said like, oh, we're all can be everybody, not just white people. It's very important. Everybody can be the victim of their own prejudices, and some of it's ignorance and some of it is racism, and like it's important to investigate which one. That's something that people be like, okay, that makes sense, right? Because if you just ask like why all white people are racist, you're being antagonistic, and you're also, it's harmful because there's a lot of racism outside the white community, and I think that we hold white people to a very high standard on the internet, which we should, but we should hold other people to the same standard. Me personally, when I was working, I experienced. I will say that there were white racist people where I worked. But the most racism I experienced were like Hispanic people towards black people a lot. And that's not me saying Hispanic people are worse than white people. I'm sure in other areas that you might see something totally different, where maybe it's a white person to a black person, or maybe it's an Asian person to a Hispanic person, or whatever. But like everybody's racist, and when we only hold one group of people to the higher standard, if anything, to me, that is almost racist in itself. I mean, think about that. You're holding white people to such a high standard, but you don't hold other people of color to that standard as well, and it feels like the racism of lowered expectations, right? I think that's something important to talk about as well.
Three answers. So yes, let's look at yes first.
Mm-hmm.
Well, are all people racist? Probably.
Yeah.
Probably. Like we have really, really intense in-group affiliative tendencies.
And yet we're supposed to suppose that maybe especially North American white people can learn to not be racist, unlike all other people in the world. That's a tough proposition.
Well, all of us, it's very difficult for all of us to overcome our in-group biases. And we never even want to do it completely because we want to love our family specially. And we also only have a limited amount of time and attention. So we have to love some people specially or do nothing at all for anyone. So this is a huge problem. So by stating it that way, that all white people are racist, you make racism a subcategory of white, and you actually underplay the terrible catastrophe and significance of the problem. And that's very dangerous because we all have to contend with this in-group preference and our proclivity to demonize anyone we put in the out-group. Mm-hmm. And that's a terrible tendency.
Yeah, and that question is one of them where I depart from what I wish were my comrades, in that are all white people racist? You know what? Probably to some extent. The white person who couldn't have an ounce of racism identified in them, even with sophisticated psychological testing, is probably vanishingly rare. Sure. And my sense of it is, when it's gotten to the point that it has, who cares? And I've often said to audiences, and I've watched some Black people in audiences, having not heard this, understand what I mean. If you really do have a basic self-love, then the fact that the whites around you have various degrees of racism really just shouldn't matter, because life consists of about 1,000 things other than whatever that residual racism is in that white person across the room who is, married to a Black person and, does all the sorts of things that these supposedly racist but hyper woke white people do. It's just, why does it matter so much? Now, it's one thing for somebody in 1925 to talk about white racism, 1955, 65. But today, my feeling about it is, with most of the white people that a Black person who talks about that sort of thing most knows, the answer is yes, most of the white people are probably very slightly racist, but not in any way that will remotely matter in your life, even including being friends with them and sometimes close friends. Why are we so obsessed with that? And I think that's a very legitimate question. Life is about so much more than obsessing over something like that, except that when you obsess over something like that, you're part of a group. It's us versus them. And you have a sense of purpose and a sense of virtue because you're the person who's being racist. But I find that a rather feeble way of going about an existence with true virtue. I've never used that word so much as today.
It might also indicate interference with the process of coming to terms with your own in-group preference and tendency to derogate whatever out-group you happen to be surrounded by. I mean, I do see this as a terribly deep human problem. I presume that in the 1970s that Jane Goodall found that chimps
very slightly racist. Yeah, you like that way that he phrased that? That's very funny.
Go on raiding parties, right? And that was a major league discovery. It shows how that proclivity to demonize the outgroup is at least 6 million years old, right? Definitely. It's deep and it's in us. And so, and we all have to contend with it. And so now we could have an intelligent conversation nonetheless about the manner in which the predominance of one ethnic group in a given society might exacerbate those tendencies.
Of course.
That's something that's certainly independent of the notion that all white people are racist. Right?
And then you can also see that, it's easy to believe that progress doesn't happen than to admit that it happens slowly. The degree to which most white Americans are racist in 2021, not to mention white Canadians from what I've seen, is much, much smaller than anybody would have expected about 30 years ago. So the question is also just extent.
Interesting.
And yet virtue is excellence in my mind. If we're talking about Aristotle, virtue is not moral upstandingness, is excellence. You can't be excellent. You can't live an excellent life if you're hobbled in distorted views of what racism is and how much it matters. These particular things will not allow you to be the best that you can be, unless you think that the best that you can be is somebody who is hyper articulate about discussing bias against other people. And what a narrow topic. There's so much to do. And so I just chafe against it.
I think that's an excellent place to close, if you don't mind. And I really enjoyed our conversation. It flew by as far as I was concerned. And I hope you
Thanks for having me.
I hope you have the success that you deserve with your new book, Woke Racism, How a New Religion is Betraying Black America. And I wish you well in the future and hope perhaps that we meet again and at least we're able to talk again.
Certainly.
Anything else?
I think we hit it all. I think I liked ending on the virtue, and the book will be coming out and we'll see how it does. But I'm glad that we had a chance to talk. I think that you and I are best known if we're talked about in the same sentences based on that exchange at Aspen. And I would venture to say that although that's really gotten around, it meant more to the audience of people who've been watching it than it meant to either one of us. And so I'm happy to have actually had a one-on-one with you.
Yes, I'm very glad that was superseded by this.
Definitely.
Thank you very much for talking with me today. I appreciate it. And
thank you for having me, Jordan.
And as I said, best of luck with your book and in general.
Many thanks.
Great conversation. The only thing I'd like to add in there is that, it can be very difficult, obviously, like they said, to completely remove yourself from being biased against like particular, or at least a group. So my what I would say that is, if you want to reduce racism against groups that you may not like, redirect that anger towards Italian people because they deserve it. They're fucking terrible people. I'm just kidding, kinda. No, I'm just kidding. This is all jokes, of course. Thank you so much for watching, guys, and another special shout out to all my Patreon and Twitch subs. If you'd like to support this channel further than you already have by just watching the video alone, go down to the links below where you can sub on my Patreon, which will allow you to get your name on this beautiful black wall. Or you can go to the Twitch page and you can actually use a free Amazon Prime sub, if you have Amazon Prime, to subscribe. Thank you very much, guys. Take care.